My name is Gülçin Karadeniz. I work at the European Environment Agency's communications team, and I would like to ask my two colleagues, Jan-Erik Petersen and Markus Erhard, to turn on their cameras and join this call. Thank you very much. Today we are going to talk about, as I said, nature, whether we can put a value on nature. And recently we published a big assessment on the state of Europe's nature, which was one of our earlier live chat topics, where we highlighted the continuing decline in Europe's biodiversity and pressures on state of nature. Today we are going to talk a little bit about how we assess changes in state of nature. So before we actually start, for our live viewers, please, if you have any questions during our live chat, insert them in the comment section below, and our colleagues will be monitoring them, and I'll be forwarding them to our two guests, my two colleagues, Markus and Jan-Erik. Hopefully we will be able to answer your questions. So maybe we start with you, Jan-Erik. Can you just clarify what you do in the European Environment Agency?
Thank you, Gülçin. I coordinate our work on ecosystem accounting. That means we are trying to develop a structured measurement of what is the extent and what's the condition of our ecosystems. And we want to use that to inform economic decisions, planning decisions, and whatever else can affect nature and its quality.
We will get back to these links between the languages, the terms that are used in accounting and capital and so on, and the links to the economy. But first, Markus, can you also explain a little bit what you do at the agency?
Yeah, thank you, Gülçin. Yeah, so my name is Markus and I work on the ecosystem assessment. So we try to understand how the ecosystems are distributed over Europe, how they're functioning, how they change. Do we go in towards a better condition of ecosystems or a worse one? And then I try to feed Jan-Erik with some information also for his work so that we can link between the ecosystem assessment in general and the accounting. But I think we will discuss this a bit later too. Thank you.
Maybe we start with this ecosystems, because Europe is home to so many different landscapes and, different, what you call ecosystems. Can you just give some examples of what it is that we are talking about?
Yeah, sure.
Mountains, coastal zones.
Yeah, there are different ways. There are many different ways to look on the nature and to classify the nature and attribute it to the different policy lines and the management and how we use nature and how we experience nature. And ecosystems as such, basically, it's a very general definition. It means it's a community of plants, animals, microorganisms, and their environment they live on. So the soil, the climate, and the weather conditions they are exposed to, the geology beyond. And I mean, as we do European-wide assessments, we look on ecosystems more on a very general way. So, for example, forest is an ecosystem for us, freshwater and lakes, marine is divided in several ecosystem types. So, yeah.
Can I also ask in this? Can I ask, is a northern European forest the same as a southern European forest for your assessment purposes?
Yeah. Well, from going top down, first, the forest is just a community of trees with some animals in there and some other plant species. But then, of course, we start to distinguish because, of course, the northern forests in Scandinavia have different tree species, different conditions than, for example, a Mediterranean forest. And so, let's say we talk to the forest community and the foresters, and then we specify according to the area and the topic we are further, let's say, investigate and assess. So, for example, if you look on specific plants, specific tree species, then you start to distinguish and separate. Yeah.
So this brings me back to the question, you do this kind of thorough, specific work, and maybe what for? would I say. You know, you said that you pass this information to Jan-Erik. What does Jan-Erik do with this information?
Yeah, not only to Jan-Erik, of course, but I mean, first we try to understand, okay, how are the ecosystems for forest, grassland, and so on, how they are distributed. So how much forest do we have in the northern countries compared to the Mediterranean, how much in Central Europe, and so on. And then we try to understand, okay, what is the physical and the chemical pressures on this forests? Are they under high pressure of nitrogen deposition or invasive alien species? Is there a lot of climate change? Is there a lot of fragmentation? Are the areas sealed by settlements and infrastructure and so on? So that we can get an idea about, okay, what is the condition of nature and how is this distributed over Europe? And then, of course, this has feeding its own policy agendas. So we talk a lot to the European Commission about this and try to help them in implementing their strategy. So, for example, the biodiversity strategy, or also other aspects of the Green Deal, as you may have heard of. And then I feed Jan-Erik with some of the information. He checks and looks, okay, what of this information can already be now put into accounting system, means to have strict rules and for asset and change detection.
Yeah, so I'll actually ask Jan-Erik, why use this kind of accounting method?
Well, you can only manage what you can measure. You can only inform policymakers or government officials about ecosystems if you can give them a quantitative value. At least if you want to have a similar information as is used for economic decision making. So economic decision making is driven by data, quantitative number of factories, output in terms of tons. And we need to ensure that what we communicate about ecosystems is perceived as being as solid and is comparable in terms of the presentation.
Before I actually ask a follow-up question, I'll ask our live viewers, if you have any questions about ecosystems and you know, putting a value on nature, please put them in the comments section in case you joined a bit later. Jan-Erik, can we actually put a value on nature? Because you're saying that you would actually try to come up with some sort of a, you know, monetary value. Does it work? Is it possible to put this kind of attribute a value?
It's a good point. I get that question often. I say we can measure it. That doesn't mean I can measure it in dollar terms, actually.
So what do you measure it as? You know, is it because, I mean, clean air for me is priceless.
I would agree that nature is also priceless, but apart from this intrinsic value for itself, we also need to have other ways of making its importance known. And we know that the intrinsic value that many people, the ethical value that many people subscribe to, hasn't helped us stopping the destruction of nature. So ecosystem accounting is about demonstrating how much we rely on nature. And to do that, we need to be able to tell how many tons of timber can come from our forest, how many tons of carbon is locked into a forest types, into different soil types. And then you have a physical measurement that you can compare to the costs of stopping climate change, because carbon sinks in forest and soils help us reduce climate warming, and we know what the cost of runaway climate warming might be.
Yeah, you actually mentioned a big potential and a big question that has been on the European policy agenda, along with the biodiversity strategy that Markus has just mentioned about, you know, carbon in the atmosphere. And of course, forests and soils are big carbon sinks along with the ocean. How accurate are these estimates that you're working on?
They are depending on what you want to measure, but I think they are very accurate in terms of knowing how much carbon forests, etc., can store. They are very accurate in terms of the major ecosystem types we want to measure. But when it comes to whether ecosystems are healthy, whether they have a good condition, that we don't have that many data. And we have to use some selected parameters for tracking that. And we feel that we need to know more about the condition to be sure that ecosystems will remain healthy.
Yeah, we'll come to the data, how we get the data, how reliable the data is, but we started receiving questions from our live audience, so thanks for submitting your questions. Kasia is asking, are there any efforts to use natural capital valuation at an EU level? So we did talk a little bit about natural, the use of language, economics language in this discussion. So what are the efforts at EU level of natural capital valuation? So this is the kind of work that you're doing, actually.
Yes, there have been reports that have been trying to estimate, for example, the economic benefits of the Natura 2000 protected areas, the EU network of protected areas. And there have been similar studies that DG Environment of the Commission and others have put forward for some years. But these are just the start, and they provide a snapshot. What we are doing together with partners in the European Commission is to put in a structured system that corresponds to international standards developed by the United Nations, to which Europe contributes. And these will then be the strong foundation that is needed to get such aspects integrated better into EU decisions.
As you rightly say, so a part of our work is about, providing a coherent structure so that this assessment can be, this evaluation can be done. We are still receiving questions, so I'll go to a question from Dimitris Gotsis. In Greece, badly sited wind farms are destroying biodiversity-rich areas, using the argument that it would cost more to have energy from solar farms instead. Is the EEA planning to quantify the cost of ecosystems lost when renewable energy sources are sited in the wrong place? Is it more costly to lose biodiversity or install more expensive but less damaging renewable energy sources for each specific EU region? It's a kind of a regional, region-specific question, but maybe you could reflect a little bit on the pluses and minuses.
I'll take that one on my chin. I think these two issues are not fully comparable. I mean, we say you can put a value on nature in terms of understanding what it contributes to our economy in terms of ecosystems and service flows. But when you have a unique piece of nature that cannot be replaced, then by definition it is priceless and is protected by EU legislation. So we think if there is a red line from legislation, a protected area, then there should be no development for whatever purpose. That's one reason why we don't do such direct comparisons, but we have done studies on bioenergy where we have played with the costs and benefits of bioenergy. And we have used principles of protecting nature, using nature sustainably to calculate what's the maximum bioenergy we can gain. And that can be rolled out for other renewable energy types too. But we wouldn't be able to provide, or we are not meant to evaluate national level decisions. That's for governments to respect their laws and for governments to do the proper planning of such projects.
But we do provide guidance and kind of a structure in the approaches that could be taken.
And I mean, additionally, there's also this point, we have now more opportunities, let's say, to get the knowledge into this system. So for example, financial taxonomy, they're now asking us to have environmental criteria in in the systems where institutions ask for funding for their investments. And there we try to go away from what I always call an engineer solution. So you have one problem, producing energy, and then you maximize the harvest of energy. And of course, this can go at the cost of other things like biodiversity. And this is exactly what we want to try to avoid now. But this is something relatively new, but upcoming. And yes, I agree with Jan-Erik, of course. Finally, it's on the planning regulations of the country and the member state to do the job properly. And this is definitely something where these trade-offs, I mean, producing energy at the cost of biodiversity, it's a no-go for us. Yeah.
I will go, we started receiving questions. So again, if you do have questions to our live viewers, please do share them. So I'll kind of try to, get you to answer as many questions as possible. Todd is asking, what do we include when we take account of nature? What specifically do we measure? So we did talk a little bit about this, carbon sink potential and so on, but maybe you could give some more examples of what is measured. And a related question from Fabiana Rice, which data is used for measuring the state of nature? How are factors such as climate change taken into account? So maybe you could take these two questions together. Who would like
Markus,
to?
Shall I take
maybe
how
you start,
we measure?
yeah.
And you look on biodiversity and state of nature reporting.
Exactly, that's what we mean by proposal. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, measure value nature. I mean, measuring is just a metric. It's physical parameters, and we have measurements for extent and condition of ecosystems. So that's a baseline that tells us, is our natural capital improving or declining? I think that's an important measure in itself. And the second point then is, you can, if you know extent and condition, you know what kind of vegetation is there, you can measure ecosystem service flows. This is what benefits people directly.
This is like clean water, clean air, timber, etc., that you are.
Regulation of water flow, purification of water, a nice landscape to enjoy. And there is hundreds of different ecosystem services. At the moment, in the EU cooperation, there are 12 different ones that have been measured in quantitative terms. And that, because it provides a benefit to economic sectors or to people, you can measure in monetary terms in principle. We don't do that directly, but partners in the European project do that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, for state of nature, how we measure it, we have a bit of a framework, and we just finalized a huge report. It's called MAS, a Mapping and Assessment of Ecosystems and the Services. So you can find that on.
Maybe you could share the links actually to the work.
You can share the link. Yeah, it's on the website of the Joint Research Center, and we will also provide a summary for policymakers in the coming months. So there we describe, okay, how we measure state of nature. And there is, of course, in first instance, there are the reporting obligations of the member states, state of nature. That was in the last expert meeting, I think, Gülçin. And then we had a list of key pressures we try to map and assess. So this is mostly nutrient and pollution, invasive alien species, also climate change, of course, and see what kind of data we have. And this we feed into the assessments. And of course, climate change is getting increasingly important, also rapidly accelerating. But we still have also the old stuff, let's say, like the nitrogen loads, the air pollution, which is still, it's improving, but it's still ongoing. And at the same time, we have now the climate change coming up, and that we all try to get assessed and combined. Of course, then often there is not enough knowledge. So for example, what is a combined impact of climate change and nitrogen on a forest? That's not always easy to say. But there's still research, a lot of research ongoing and also needed.
But I think what was important to the reports that you mentioned, it is actually happens to be, from what I understand, the most comprehensive assessment of its sort based on the most reliable data that exists as things stand. Because as far as I understand, this is the kind of data that member states report regularly based on a common kind of criteria. So it is comparable. So it does indicate the kind of trends that, Jan-Erik, you were mentioning in terms of, improvements or degradation and so on. We are receiving a lot of questions, so I want to get to them as much as possible, but we will share the links. Ace-Lymph is asking, can you explain how you work out the cost of an area? Are you looking at kilometer squares, or is it more a case of the services provided? Are businesses able to buy natural areas? If they are, will they have to spend that amount of money to rehabilitate a different area? Will this take into account the value of older and more complex systems? I'm not sure if you can answer all these things, but I'm just putting them to you. A follow-up question from Fabiana on bioenergy, as you mentioned, Jan-Erik. So certain activities should be possible within the protected area. Maybe just a quick clarification on that.
All right. Well, what we work on so far is information about the public good nature. And that is for public policy making, so decisions by governments or at European Union level. In Europe, in terms of the spatial scale of the data, we integrate the data we have in a 1 kilometer grid. So the question got it approximately right. But we don't put a value on the 1 square kilometer, on any given square kilometer. Also, where EU partners develop a calculation of the value of ecosystem service flows, then this would be for a country or for the overall European Union. The data are not good enough to do it really at fine spatial scale. And I think it's not appropriate to value one given area as such. We want to manage it better. We don't want to sell it. We want to manage it better, and we want to explain why it needs to be well managed. And so then, given it's for public information, what we produce, businesses can take it into account in terms of sensing which ecosystem service is very relevant. But I think what's more important for guiding business decisions is really regulation of what activity is allowed to take place, maximum limits of pollution, spatial planning, and then the general drive to be more efficient in what they do and reduce costs. And there's some connections, but this is, I think, second step. Final point, bioenergy, protected areas. We have actually a large share of protected areas in the European Union, above 20%. Given that we have used all of Europe for forestry or agriculture, grazing, there's a lot of agriculture activity in protected areas. And this can be compatible with the protection of nature, and it might be very beneficial if it's extensive traditional practices for nature. And I would also say, in our reports say that you can harvest certain amounts of biomass for energy. For example, the straw that has no other use, etc. But that needs to be under strict conditions, and you need to be in the sustainable limit. That is then a fine decision to make. But it's possible to produce bioenergy from protected areas if there is already economic land use going on.
Yeah, thank you. There's a very quick kind of related thing about the firms and so on. Maybe we just take that one from Anastasia. Do you think that firms and organizations, in particular the wind energy sector, account for environment and biodiversity? I'm not sure if you know of companies reflecting in their decisions as you know, the impacts on biodiversity and so on. But maybe you could just briefly touch upon that point.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, actually.
Yeah.
There is a natural capital coalition, which is an organization set up by businesses. There's some large internationals that aim to measure their biodiversity impact, and there are smaller companies that aim to avoid any biodiversity impact. It varies a lot, but there is a growing movement.
That is reassuring, actually. You know, so maybe some of our viewers could look into it further. Alessandra Pacciaroni is asking, are there any endeavors to develop a system of positive measures, such as economic incentives, but not limited to these, to introduce nature in business value creation, analysis, and mindset?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, it starts what I mentioned with the financial taxonomy. Means that enterprises, landowners, whoever who wants to have take some investments and some funding for the investments, they are more and more obliged to follow special boundary conditions, and they are more and more setting environmental standards. So, for example, if you invest, you want to have subsidies in growing a certain product, then the regulations foresee that you also take into account, you have to report what is the impact on biodiversity, are there positive, negative effects, and of course the incentives to go to improve, let's say, biodiversity and the condition of nature in very general. Yeah.
We are still receiving a lot of questions and we don't have a lot of time left. So I'll try to bundle some of the questions and maybe you could give just very quick answers to some of the points because some of them are coming back. But in case you want to take notes or something, Rafael is asking, can you provide some information on how to assess the value of services bound to soil biodiversity? I know that you're not soil experts, but in case there are some studies, maybe you could reflect, and we could have another discussion on soil in coming months. Regina is asking, in what areas are the biggest data gaps for improving the estimations that you mentioned? Kate is asking, when valuing ecosystem accounts, how do you account for the fact that restoring biodiversity is more costly than conservation? She refers to Dasgupta review on biodiversity. And lastly, Areti is asking, in terms of wildlife, is there also a way to measure its value in monetary terms? For example, setting up a wind farm, you can measure its contribution to climate change, etc. How can you measure the value of losing a bird's population or even a species? So something on soil biodiversity, the biggest data gaps for estimations, the ecosystem accounts, restoring biodiversity is more costly, and wildlife.
Right.
So Jan-Erik, you go first.
It's mostly in the accounting area, sorry. Soil biodiversity, I would say let's take note of who wrote to us and we'll send a link, unless Markus can answer. Data gaps, it really is biodiversity distribution, species distribution. We only have data at national level. We need more spatially differentiated information. So we need focused surveys on biodiversity in situ. When it comes to nature being more difficult to replace than to preserve in terms of the effort, then I fully agree. We are not at that stage where we would make such trade-offs. We just measure what we have, and then we hope that the principle of keep what you have rather than destroy and then replace is taken into account. Wildlife, yes, I mean, there's studies that look at existence value. I mean, there is quite fancy valuation studies that you can do by asking people how much they were willing to pay for preserving a species or landscape or something. So there is possibilities to do it, but I don't think we should try to price everything. And I think also that the methodologies depend a lot on the context, and they are not fully mature.
Maybe the links with policy and the fact that, you know, some things are priceless, no matter how much the value that you put on it. Markus, would you like to add some points?
Yeah, for the soil, I try. Well, for the soil, I have to say I'm not aware of a soil-specific study, because soil is often considered in the context of the ecosystem, means the vegetation, the animals and plants, which is related to the soil, of course. But we can look, and I don't know, Gülçin, if possible, we could provide some reply if we find something. For the costs of species and the value of species. I mean, sometimes there are assessments, indirect assessments, means, for example, especially for tourism. Yeah, many people realize that, for example, a whale is much more valuable for tourism, people visiting and do whale watching, than just being killed and eaten up. So this sort of assessments exist, but then you quickly end with your assessment on species where you simply can't put a value as such, because often you may have the value in the future, and it's not really linked to any economic activity, but definitely is extremely valuable for us. Directly or indirectly providing other services, decomposing organic material in the soil, for example, or doing other things. So there we are missing, let's say, also appropriate approaches, and also a consensus on these values, in a way of how society and people accept this as essential part of their human well-being. Somewhere it's always in our minds, and especially, of course, in the people who are interested in the environment, but it's not really something which can be transferred in an absolute valuation as such, as far as I am aware of. Yeah.
And it's possibly true that, you know, compared to, you know, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere or air pollutants measured in concentrations and so on, nature, when it comes to measuring these things, are, of course, much more difficult and much more complex, which might lead to this nature crisis. Last remarks from you, Jan-Erik, before we wrap up.
Well, I thought it was a very interesting chat, very good questions. And we'll try to reflect on all those as we develop the system further.
Okay, thank you. And what about you, Markus?
Yeah, definitely. I always take this as an incentive for further thinking, and it's also, you know, we sometimes live a bit in our own bubble, and now getting the questions from outside is even helpful. It's not only nice to have, but also supports the way how we should proceed and think, you know, of these things. Yeah, definitely.
So with those words, I'd like to thank you both for having taken part in this Ask an EEA Expert. And I'd like to thank our viewers and the team that has been supporting us. We will be back with other topics. And for those interested, I suggest that we also share the link to the previous one. It was, I think, in early this year on the state of nature, where we talked more specifically on the degradation in biodiversity and so on. So thank you very much, and we'll be back with other topics.